Hello everyone, welcome back. I got some really good ones for you today on this Saturday, January 28th, 2023. Lots been going on inside the markets and the economy, more specifically developments in the tech sector with regard to layoffs, automation, and AI trends. We have some geopolitical tensions rising between NATO and Russia that we need to discuss, unfortunately. And then on the back half of this video, I was going to provide for you my framework on inflation versus deflation. Bit of a psyop there. Those terms are kind of thrown around pretty loosely in the media and out on the street. So hopefully by the end of that discussion, you'll have a better understanding of inflation, deflation, and I'll discuss disinflation as well than maybe like 90% of people out there. That's kind of the goal for this video. So let's dive right into it, shall we? Markets. The three major U.S. stock indices, look, they've been inflating pretty much the entirety of the year. My suspicion is it's because the Fed is winding down its tightening campaign, these raising interest rates. Fed's kind of looking at maybe one or two more interest rate hikes, and then markets are kind of telegraphing that we'll be holding rates steady or even cutting by as early as summer. So as the Fed winds down with all these aggressive interest rate hikes, the markets, which is very forward-looking, is looking out at the next 18 months going, I don't really see the amount of rate hikes I thought I would have to deal with. I think I'm going to inflate. Kind of getting excited off of that. So you've been seeing that all year. In tech, though, I do want to discuss these layoffs. We've had a lot of layoffs in tech. My suspicion is that in 2020, a lot of these tech companies, which had enjoyed a massive boom between 2010 and 2020, these FANG stocks, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, Microsoft. You know, in 2020, I would say we kind of peaked in that, and a lot of these tech companies were trying to show the world that they were still growing, so they were overhiring. And now they're in a position where they overhired and the Fed started to raise interest rates, which puts a lot of downward pressure on the tech-heavy NASDAQ, which is very interest rate sensitive. And as the NASDAQ started to hemorrhage and we saw $5 trillion worth of capital leave the tech space, well, then you had a bunch of layoffs. Layoffs are not a leading indicator, they're a lagging indicator, meaning you don't have a bunch of layoffs and then markets crash. You generally have markets crash and then a bunch of layoffs. Well, tech was hit specifically particularly bad with the Fed's tightening campaign. Elon Musk saw about a 50% drawdown. Mark Zuckerberg saw like a $75 billion drawdown. All these huge tech companies really took a gut punch with the Fed raising interest rates and bond yields starting to go up. And these companies which were able to foster a culture of like free yoga and Starbucks, I guess the chickens are just finally coming home to roost. So I don't really think that these layoffs that we're seeing in tech are precipitating a massive crash in the markets. I think we saw a massive crash in tech, and then the layoffs came as a fallout. And now these markets are looking forward. The layoffs, they're standing in the layoffs with the layoffs behind them. The markets are looking forward, going, it's only a matter of time before the Federal Reserve starts to hold rates steady or cut them, and it's only a matter of time before tech companies start to rehire. So the markets, being very forward-looking, aren't really scared of all these tech layoffs as much as you might suspect. We also have a situation where AI and automation is starting to take a lot of jobs anyway. So I think Google doesn't need the payroll that it used to. Apple doesn't need the payroll that it used to. And frankly, most of these companies that aren't even in tech might not need the payroll they used to. We have kiosks replacing cashiers. We have technological advancements that are displacing white-collar workers even. So if you're just a researcher at a law firm, you might be staring down the barrel of a layoff because they have software programs that can perform the research for you. Automation and AI is really destroying everybody's jobs, so don't think that anybody is safe. But it's also not something that I'm particularly upset about. We used to have an ice man, right, that would chop off blocks of ice and sell them to you. We used to have a milkman, but because of technology, automation, and AI, we're able to get rid of a lot of jobs, free those people up to do other things. So it really is just kind of the way of the world, especially because these kiosks that are going in at McDonald's to replace the cashier, look, the price of that fixed expense is really coming down to a point where it makes a lot of sense to go with that. And a fixed expense to an entrepreneur is always superior to a variable expense, and humans, unfortunately, are variable. A red box video rental machine or a kiosk at McDonald's doesn't call in sick, doesn't need a dental plan, doesn't steal money out of the cash register. Humans are quite variable, and so as the cost of this technology comes down and it becomes, a lot more affordable to just run fixed expenses, I would expect entrepreneurs to do that. It's just kind of the way of business. So it stinks, and I'm certain that automating the trucking industry is going to destroy like half the jobs for men in America. So, it can be very disruptive, but it just kind of is what it is, and it can't be stopped. My thoughts on it, and it shouldn't be. So AI and automation is getting pretty crazy. Look, yesterday I tried out OpenAI's GPT chatbot. The thing's crazy. I told it to write me a script for a commercial. I told it to write me a reggae song. I told it to write me a 500-word story about a speck of urine living on the bathroom floor of the Queen's palace. And it wrote me this whole story, and the Queen, at the end, loves the speck. It was crazy. So, and quite good. So I am becoming quite enamored with some of this artificial intelligence. They are just algorithms. It's not like it's sentient or conscious yet, but we're heading there. So yeah, the OpenAI chatbot is pretty cool. Everybody's been kind of ranting and raving about it. It's kind of like the new crypto, the new flavor of the month, I guess you could say, would be artificial intelligence. So yeah, seeing some weird developments in tech, layoffs, artificial intelligence, automation. Been pretty crazy for the tech sector. Been pretty crazy for these markets that continue to inflate on stable to lower bond yields, stable to lower interest rates, inflation persisting. But yeah, we've seen markets pretty crazy lately. Tech sector acting pretty crazy lately. And then, my gosh, these geopolitical tensions rising. These 31 tanks that NATO is sending to Ukraine to fight Russia. These tanks it's not casual, okay? And NATO knows this. You're not just sprinkling some tanks onto a battlefield and saying, go get them, or sprinkling some guns, go get them. It requires permanent infrastructure. The explicit costs of these 31 Abrams tanks is like $200 million, but implicitly it's going to cost a lot more. The max range of the Abrams was classified, so it's crazy that now I guess, people are going to know what this technology is capable of. Look, this is not casual at all. I see this as a real escalation. So, unfortunate. It just is what it is. Russia's not backing down. That's super unfortunate and is what it is. And NATO's not backing down. So now they're floating the idea of F-16s, okay? And maybe we're staring down the barrel of an air war. So things are clearly escalating geopolitically, and I'm not sure how much of that is baked into the markets either. So I would anticipate, if we find ourselves in an air war soon, or sending another 31 or 50 or 100 Abrams tanks, or God forbid NATO troops, well, expect markets to really not have fully priced in something like that, or God forbid something worse. So, nothing good going on there, but you cannot ignore it. And then I was going to discuss with you guys my framework for inflation versus deflation. Let's dive right into it, all right? This will be good, though. So first off, I want to say that inflation is a psyop. because the definition changes. It really does depend on who you ask. If you ask me what inflation is, I say it's expanding the money supply, expanding credit. But if you ask somebody else, they might say it's rising prices. According to the people on CNBC, they'd probably tell you it's rising prices, where I would say rising prices are merely a symptom of increasing the money supply. So right off the bat, depending on what economic school you would like to subscribe to, the inflation has a different definition. And so right off the bat, people are starting to get confused, you know? Not only that, but the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which the government uses to track year-over-year inflation, it's engineered to understate it. It excludes food and energy prices. It doesn't use rents. It uses owner's equivalent rents. Look, if real rent prices year over year and real egg prices year over year were factored into the CPI, we'd probably be looking at like closer to 20% inflation. But the government has been able to state it at around 7%, excuse me, only 7%, because they're able to kind of fudge it. And what do you think would be their incentive to understate inflation? It's because they want to engineer more of it. They like expanding the money supply. So they don't want to come out every year being like, oh man, we're really destroying your currency. We should really draw liquidity out of the system and stop printing money. No, they want every excuse to do the opposite. They want every excuse to have wiggle to print more money because they're telling you inflation really isn't that bad. So inflation tends to get understated by the CPI, and it's engineered to do that. It's like kind of there is a conspiracy going on there. And inflation's a psyop because everyone's inflation rate is different. You know, Michael Saylor points out that it's more of a vector. It's my inflation rate is totally different from a 20-year-old's right now who's halfway through college, about to start his career, maybe wants to buy his first house or buy his first car or start a family. So now he has to introduce, you know, insurance inflation into his basket. You know, maybe you're just somebody that likes to sit at home all day with mom and just eat rice and tea and just watch TV. If that's the case, your inflation rate probably is about 7%, because what's your inflation basket? Well, like pizza, you know, rice, a new pair of shoes, maybe. So everyone's inflation rate's different. If I was about to have a kid right now, my inflation rate would look a lot different, because I would have to buy baby formula and diapers and include what the prices of those are doing into my inflation rate. So everybody's inflation rate right off the bat is different, and that kind of muddies the waters a little bit. But ultimately, I would say inflation and deflation is a game of tug-of-war. So you always have inflationary forces at work and deflationary forces at work. Your inflationary forces being dishonest defaults, QE, helicopter money, NIRP, so negative interest rate policy, ZIRP, zero interest rate policy, universal basic income, repo market operations, stock buybacks, foreign markets dumping U.S. treasuries or getting rid of their U.S. dollars, or just most other forms of financial engineering. I just rattled off inflationary forces, but they're always pulling one way against deflationary forces, which could be honest defaults, QE if you're talking to a MMT person, automation, artificial intelligence, aging demographics, reverse repo market operations, or exporting your inflation to other countries, exporting dollars to other countries, deflationary. So inflation versus deflation, it's always a game of tug-of-war. And let me kind of just parse those a little bit. So inflationary forces, we discussed dishonest default. A dishonest default would be you owe people a bunch of money, but instead of being like can't have, don't pay, you just start cutting bad checks. What do I owe them? Print the money, fire up the machine that prints the money and just pay the people we owe money to. That's a dishonest default and quite inflationary. QE, according to the Keynesian and Austrians, is quite inflationary because the Fed has to conjure up currency out of thin air to buy bonds to drive bond yields down and incentivize commercial banks to make loans instead of seek safety in bonds. Also, that QE money from the Fed, which was conjured out of thin air, might be used to purchase commercial banks' toxic assets to take them off their balance sheet. So QE is inflationary if you ask a Keynesian or an Austrian, and I would agree with that. But if you ask a modern monetary theorist, they would say no. They would say QE is deflationary because QE is where the government, the public sector, actually crowds out the private sector, and it makes the environment quite deflationary because there's not really a lot of money circulating in the main street in the real economy. It's all just like government bank reserves sitting on institutional balance sheets. It ultimately results in deflation because it's a net, it's a ton of money, but it's just sitting. And if money's just sitting, you don't necessarily see that inflation. So helicopter money, okay, stimmies. When we went into lockdown and they just started cutting $1,200 checks to everybody, quite inflationary. The whole term helicopter money came, I think, from the GFC, great financial crisis of like 2008 and 9, when the whole idea would be the government would just like fly helicopters over the cities and drop bags of money out to the people. So stimmies, helicopter money, quite inflationary. Talk about directly expanding the money supply than just giving it out to people. Quite inflationary. Negative interest rate policy, we don't have to spend too much time on that, but it might come in the future, okay? It's the opposite of the way you perceive this game going. So negative interest rate policy is where instead of putting your money in a savings account and getting an interest rate on it, if you put your money in a savings account, it's a negative interest rate, so the bank starts taking your money. So you better invest it, right? And not only that, but if you're borrowing money, the bank is paying you to borrow money. So let's say you got qualified for a mortgage with a negative interest rate. As long as you can make that mortgage payment, the bank will throw in like, $50 every month, or give you a gift card, or throw in a toaster just because you could make the mortgage payments on this super inflated piece of property, because negative interest rates rocket fuel for risk assets in inflation. Universal basic income, UBI, inflationary. You're just giving money to people to live and pay their bills, no matter what. So we're already starting to see it. UBI already has one foot in the door. In California, people are getting like gas cards and stuff. UBI, it could be here pretty soon and become quite entrenched, because automation and AI, as we've discussed, is kind of stealing a lot of jobs, and people got to eat. So we got to pay these people to live. Tell me how that works out, but UBI is quite inflationary. Repo market operations, Fed gives cash to commercial banks give collateral to the Fed. Now these commercial banks have all this cash, inflationary. Stock buybacks. So let's say I'm Apple in this example. I could call up JP Morgan, borrow a couple $2 billion, call low interest rate of like 4%, and then I could take my $2 billion, buy my own stock with it, make the stock go up 8%, pay back the loan and keep the spread, So stock buybacks, quite inflationary, at least for the financial system. But, I don't know how much of that cash makes its way into the real economy. So maybe stock buybacks aren't inflationary for Main Street and the real economy. And then foreign markets, let's say, start to dump U.S. treasuries, and, they're sitting on dollar reserves and they want to get rid of them. Very inflationary for the U.S. domestic economy, because all those dollars will come back to the states and start chasing the same amount of goods and services. All that inflation that we exported to other countries' balance sheets now comes back into our economy, starts chasing the same amount of goods and services. That could be hyperinflation. So quite inflationary. And then just, other forms of financial engineering, because we have a debt-based economic system, okay, which requires that more and more currency be printed in perpetuity just to remain where you are. Never mind additional growth. We don't have a wealth-based system, okay, where like savings and capital investment rules the day and the money's backed by gold. Like, that's a wealth-based system, not a debt-based system. We were wealth-based before 1971. Then we defaulted on the gold standard. The global economy has been debt-based ever since. So yeah, you got like inflation and deflation. Then the wild cards for that being Fed rhetoric and market expectations. So like, what I mean by wild cards, well, what throws a wrench into the whole inflation deflation debate? Well, if the Fed comes out tomorrow and they say we're raising interest rates 5% today, markets would, and the Fed comes out tomorrow and says we're lowering interest rates 5% today, markets would to the moon. So Fed rhetoric can adjust market expectations, and that can have effects on inflation or deflation in that little game of tug of war. Because remember, it's not like inflation and deflation. It's a game of tug of war, okay? It's a tension. And it's who net wins out in this game of tug of war that ultimately you end up seeing rising or falling prices, or how it ultimately ends up playing out in markets. So yeah, it's pretty crazy stuff, but you see how inflation and deflation is a bit of a psyop because you don't even have these words clearly defined before people start to discuss them, and you can have a different definition for inflation. It's not necessarily a wrong one. As I've pointed out, my inflation definition is increasing the money supply, whereas a Keynesian would say, no, it's rising prices. Crazy stuff. Inflation, deflation, bit of a psyop. CPI is engineered to understate it. Everyone's inflation rate's different. Everyone's definition's different. Gets kind of sticky, kind of messy. And then disinflation, and then I'm going to let you go, all right? Disinflation just means that there's still inflation, but the rate of inflation is falling. So let's say we have 7% inflation this year, and then next year we have 6%, and then the following year we have only 5% inflation. You still have inflation, it's 5%, but the rate is falling. That's disinflation. You've been hearing the term disinflation thrown around a lot in the mainstream, so that's kind of what they're describing there. Yeah, so we discussed inflation, deflation, that game of tug of war, how it's kind of a psyop, what the inflationary forces look like, what the deflationary forces look like, what kind of the wild cards are and all that. So yeah, pretty helpful, I hope. I just kind of, that's just kind of my framework, so take it or leave it, but I really hope you got something out of that. So yeah, we've discussed markets, what's going on inside of tech specifically. We've discussed geopolitical tensions, and then I gave you guys my framework for inflation versus deflation in that game of tug of war. I hope you found this video useful. I hope you enjoyed it. Like, subscribe, share, comment, whatever. You guys are awesome. We're just going to keep going, okay? Till next time.